Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva, and we've got a terrific show for you today. We have an author joining us from California who's written this tremendous biography of Academy Award winning actor. I think he would have maybe wished he had directed some of his movies. Academy Award winning actor Lee Marvin. It's a book that's gotten a tremendous amount of praise. I'll read you one, for instance. Thanks to Epstein's literary efforts, Lee Marvin's place in the pantheon of legitimate silver screen heroes is secure. And that was a quote from Marshall Terrell, author of Steve McQueen, The Life of a Legend of a Life and Legend, rather, of a Hollywood icon. Joining us on the phone from California to talk about his book, Lee Marvin, Point Blank, Dwayne Epstein. Dwayne, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Larry. I appreciate it.
Now, you spent an awful long time working on this book. I mean, in excess of 10 years. What drew you to the subject matter? Because I assume that you never met Lee Marvin while he was still living.
No, actually, I did not meet him. He passed before I even took the project on. He died in 1987, and I began working on it in 1994, stating, making the point that it's been almost twice as long as 10 years. And by the way, that was not intentional. I took nearly 20 years to get it to market based on the fact that every publisher I came in contact with said that Marvin had been gone too long. People don't remember him. There's no market for a book on Lee Marvin. And luckily, finally, in 2012, Tim Schaffner of Schaffner Press took a chance and decided to publish it, and it wound up in 2014 making number 4 on the New York Times bestsellers list. So I only mention that to show you that publishers and people in the industry don't always know what the public wants.
Oh, I would agree, and I think that's why, especially through the several authors that we've had on the show over the last few years, that so many of them have gone into self-publishing. Again, that's another story for another time, but
indeed.
Obviously...
I almost did that myself at this point.
Yeah, at this point, the great folks over at Schaffner Press that you've told me privately about certainly saw something in that. And how ironic that they're based out of Arizona, and of course Lee spent some of his last years fleeing Hollywood, settling in Tucson. But
yeah, as a matter of fact, that had something to do with Tim Schaffner agreeing to do the book, because it's kind of karmic in that, excuse me, when he was considering it, my agent, my wonderful agent, Mike Hamelberg, who sadly passed away a year ago, he had submitted it to Tim, and while Tim was mulling it over, he had gone to the local video store to rent a movie, and they were having a Lee Marvin night at the video store, and they were highlighting several of his films, and people who worked there, because Lee had lived in Tucson, told some stories about Lee, and that kind of pushed Tim over the edge into deciding, what the heck, I'm going to do this book.
Sure.
So it helped.
Now, you dedicate the book to the memory of your parents, which is not surprising when an author writes a book that they put a lot of sweat and labor in, but also some members of the Marvin family. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure, indeed. Well, in the hardcover, at the time the hardcover came out, I dedicated it to Lee's youngest daughter, Claudia, whom I spoke with briefly on the phone, but didn't get a chance to interview her. She unfortunately passed away from kidney disease or liver disease, I don't remember which, but in any event, her brother, Lee's first child, he had 4 kids, one son, the oldest, Christopher. Christopher agreed to be interviewed, and at length, and he was a wonderful person to interview. He was very open. Eventually, he opened up to me, and I even talked him into writing the afterword. But when the book was in the process of coming out, he asked me if I'd be willing to dedicate the opening to his sister, who had just passed, and I said absolutely. I didn't really know her, but at his request, I absolutely did. And then sadly, about 6 months to a year after the hardcover came out, Christopher passed away of a brain tumor.
I was going to say, if I recall, I did my math right, it seemed that with each generation, and again, I don't know, nor do I care to ask about any demons Christopher may have had, but it appears that Christopher may have actually died a year or two in terms of age, younger than his dad.
Indeed, he did. 3 years younger.
3 years, and given, you know...
Well, Lee was 63 when he died. In my opinion, he died prematurely, because if you see pictures of him towards the end of his life, he looked much older than 63.
Oh, I would say he looked almost 20 years older. I mean...
Indeed. And Christopher was like a month short of his 60th birthday when he passed.
And also, Lee's dad, I believe, outlived his son and his grandson. So it's just ironic that, again...
No, true. Actually, no. Lee's father died in 1970.
No, I'm in terms of years of age.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Lee's father, Monty Marvin, I don't remember exactly how old he was, but once again, he was another individual who looked much older than his actual years at the time of his death. Part of it being the specter of alcoholism.
Absolutely. We've got a great photo here, if we can get this, a shot of a young Lee Marvin with a couple of folks, and the gentleman to the left of Lee's on the far right, a gentleman with the striped vest, veteran character actor Keenan Wynn, whose father, of course, was Ned Wynn, and or Ed Wynn, I beg your pardon, and grandson or son, I believe, was Ned Wynn. So again, another family tree there of acting.
The Wynn dynasty.
Oh, absolutely.
It's great.
Here, I don't even know if you know that, and I know you're from back east originally, I believe. The old WNEW with Channel 5 out of New York that I grew up watching, the letters NEW actually standed for, because now it's a Fox station, Network of Ed Wynn, because Ed Wynn actually owned the station back in the late 40s and early 50s. So.
Well, now, see, there you got one up on me. I did not know that.
Yeah, so when you do the Wynn dynasty, you can include that quote for me. There you go.
Right on.
But anyway, back...
Just real quick.
Yeah.
We interviewed, because Lee Marvin and Keenan Wynn were best friends. If Lee Marvin had a best friend, it was Keenan Wynn. And I was able to interview both of Keenan Wynn's sons. Tracy Keenan Wynn, who is a Emmy Award-winning screenwriter and TV writer, and his son and his brother, Ned Wynn, who also is a writer. And they told wonderful tales about their dad and Lee Marvin.
Yeah, in the book, just for the viewers' benefit, I was impressed. There's a tremendous, of course, over the time spent researching the book, tremendous amount of great anecdotes from folks, some of whom are still with us, and some who, by the time the book did come together and come out, had unfortunately passed as well, because again, they were of that era of Lee Marvin for sure. But
Indeed.
Tremendous people. Funny, growing up, when I thought of Lee Marvin, and of course this came out in the book, and I said, wow, how ironic this is. When I thought of Lee Marvin, I immediately thought of Charles Bronson, not realizing that they had been in several movies together, but just that sort of new concept of almost an anti-hero that came out in the late 60s, 70s, even throughout the 80s. Those two guys worked together a few times.
Indeed, they did. They both appeared in their first film together. In very small parts. Excuse me. It was a Gary Cooper service comedy called The USS Tea Kettle. Later changed the title to You're in the Navy Now, and under any title, it still didn't really click. But in any event, Bronson and Marvin were in it. So also making his film debut was Jack Warden. Jack Webb was in the cast too, but he had already kind of established himself. But Marvin and Bronson's career, as you said a moment ago, because their personas were not the kind of the previous matinee idol-looking guys like Tyrone Power and Errol Flynn, their careers intersected, and it took them a very long time, if at all. In some cases, actors can work their whole lives and never make it to any level of greater success, but they both reached a level of superstardom by the late 60s and early 70s. And because of the kinds of films they made and the way they looked, they consequently worked together a lot, from the very beginning of the career until the very end of the career. One of the last films both of them made, actually, I take that back. Bronson worked a decade or two more, but the last film they were in together was Death Hunt, which wasn't bad. It could have been a better film, but it was just great seeing these, old war horses on film together.
Oh, sure.
And of course, they were in The Dirty Dozen, and they did a couple of TV shows together too. Bronson was on an episode of Marvin's show M Squad, and they were a type of an actor that it just seemed logical that based on the kind of films that were being made, it was inevitable they would work together.
Now, you refer in the book, as far as for those that will have the good fortune of reading the book or who have read it, again, the title Point Blank, obviously we know who Lee Marvin is, but then say, well, what's Point Blank? Well, it's a movie title, of course, but it's also what you refer to as kind of an ushering in by Marvin, Bronson, and several others, a new concept of violence movies, one that you refer to as Point Blank.
Correct. It was Lee Marvin, you know, a lot of people sometimes would credit Clint Eastwood with bringing in the new age of, for better or for worse, violence and action and realism on film. The truth is, Marvin predates Clint Eastwood, and previous to Lee Marvin were people like John Wayne of the previous generation. And while they did action films, and some of their films were indeed violent, it was a more of a almost cartoony nature, as Marvin himself had said several times in interviews, that in a John Wayne, you know, fight scene, two guys beat the hell out of each other at a bar, and when the fight's over, they smile at each other and buy each other a drink, and there's a little trickle of blood in the corner of John Wayne's mouth, and that's about it. But because of what Marvin experienced in World War II, as a combat Marine in the Marines island hopping campaign, he did 21 landings with the Marines, and he was wounded on Saipan just before his division went on to Iwo Jima next. And because of what he experienced, and he internalized that and consciously decided, he didn't consciously necessarily decide to become an actor, that was more circumstantial, but when he did become an actor, it became a conscious decision on his part to make whatever violence or action he had to portray on screen as real as possible. And, you know, there's the old question, does the time make the man or does the man make the time? And often enough, it's a combination of the two. And that was certainly the case with Lee Marvin, in that he started to come into prominence around the time that the Hollywood studio system had broken down, the production code was no longer in existence, and by the mid-'60s, when there was an ocean shift in the cultural landscape and the social landscape with the Vietnam War and assassinations and rioting and demonstrations and all kinds of things going on in the decade, that included the arts and filmmaking, and they became controversial as well. And when it came to riding the crest of that and purposely making more realistic action or violent films, Lee Marvin led the way. I mean, the film Point Blank itself, although largely dismissed when it first came out, it has since gained a kind of a cult status, and it's been called the first art house action film.
And that was that was around 1967 that Point Blank came out, correct?
Yeah, it is. And the thing that's interesting about that year, 67 is a pivotal point in a lot of ways, but on film, when it came to both sex and violence, but more violence, it was the year of not only Point Blank, but it was also the year of Bonnie and Clyde, and it was the year of The Dirty Dozen. He put out both films the same year, and Bosley, there's a real quick little anecdote. Bosley Crowther condemned Point Blank for its violence. And it came out like about 3 months before Bonnie and Clyde, kind of setting the stage for Bonnie and Clyde, because when Bonnie and Clyde was released, Bosley Crowther hated that even more and said as much. And he wound up getting fired for that. Wow. The New York Times fired him. They asked him to restate his comments because the film was getting better reviews elsewhere, and he stood by what he said, and he was given an early retirement, I think was the term they used.
There you go. A term that is still prevalent today for sure.
But yeah, the point being, though, it's not largely remembered as such, but Point Blank kind of set the stage for the acceptance of Bonnie and Clyde.
Gotcha.
It opened the floodgates, but people forget that. And it wasn't nearly as violent as as Bonnie and Clyde was, but in its own way, it did things that had never been done on film before, and it still reverberates now. Other than the clothes they wear in the film, I see that movie as timeless. It looks like it was made yesterday for a contemporary audience.
Dwayne Epstein joining us, author of Lee Marvin, Point Blank, published by Schaffner Press. For more information, www.pointblankbook.com. we talked a little bit about, of course, the participation of the Marvin family. I gather you also had quite extensive access to Lee's first wife, Betty. Am I correct?
You are correct in that, and I got very lucky there. Betty Marvin, still alive, wonderful woman. She literally opened herself up to me in terms of her years with Lee, and put me in contact with others because she liked what I was. Where I was approaching the story from. I wasn't interested in doing anything necessarily salacious or exploitive, and she could tell that by the conversation we were having. And she talked Christopher, her son, into talking to me. He didn't want to at first. And also one of my favorite things I looked into was being able to interview Lee Marvin's brother, Robert, who was a year and a half older than him. Now, Robert had never been interviewed before by anybody. He turned down several attempts at being interviewed. And first of all, it wasn't easy to find him either. And this was before the saturated use of the internet, where you can find anybody anytime. I had known that he had been a teacher in the New York City school district, and my cousin was a shop steward in the school, in the teachers union in New York. So I asked her to look him up, and she found a Robert Marvin living in Bearsville, New York, which is in the Woodstock area. And she said, I don't know if that's him or not, but you can give it a try. And I did. And when I called the number, the minute I heard his voice answer the phone, I knew I had the right Robert Marvin, because he sounded just like Lee.
I have to ask, was he also a smoker? Because I'm sure that contributed to the voice over the years.
Actually, no. Surprisingly, but his brother Lee was a tremendous smoker. He smoked 5 packs a day.
I think when I started the book, it was 3 packs. By the time he was in his last few years, I swear it was up to 4 packs. I mean, I can't even imagine that. But
his son told me that when he would visit him in Tucson, he had to use an oxygen tank sometimes, and he would take off the mask to light a cigarette.
Wow.
There's a guy who needed a cigarette.
Not uncommon, my friend. I've known a few people like that over the years, I got to tell you.
Indeed.
In the book, again, just to kind of put it in perspective, as great as an actor as he was, and I agree with you, underrated to some degree, again, he obviously dealt with several issues that in those days probably were not even conceptualized or understood, or probably didn't even have a name. Based on your research and the people you've talked to, basically in the book it implies that he probably had ADD, attention deficit disorder. Dyslexia was apparently because he had great struggles with even reading, whether it was on a social level or I can only imagine when it came to learning scripts. And then, of course, after being in the war, probably the early onset of post-traumatic PTSD. Let me use a simplified version. After serving in World War II, I mean, do you think that a lot of those things, and followed by the alcoholism later on, all contributed to such a volatile personality?
Oh, without a doubt. And there are certain things about what you just said that I'd like to elaborate on slightly. In that, first and foremost, I am not an expert. I am not I have absolutely no experience or training whatsoever in the field of post-traumatic stress disorder. Merely an educated assumption made, a prognosis made on my part based on what I discovered in both his own personal experiences and what others I interviewed told me about those experiences. In that, as I did more research, if you look at a list of 10 most common symptoms of PTSD, at first I thought he had like 5 to 8 of them. He actually had all 10.
Wow.
He definitely had PTSD. And he, even without knowing what it was on occasion, he would voice the symptoms himself to those closest to him. And what's interesting is, after the book came out, I had some contact with people who had told me that they had PTSD themselves and didn't realize it and what have you. Now, at the time, Lee Marvin was alive. He passed away in 1987, and in the early 80s is when the VA started getting massive amounts of veterans coming in with very similar symptoms, and it was slowly came to the realization. I mean, at first it was based on, I think, mostly Agent Orange and the effects of that. But when they started talking about the traumas and what they were experiencing, they all had, obvious common threads, and it was plain and simple that they had PTSD. Now we all know better that PTSD, and all different names and forms, battle fatigue, shell shock, what have you, has existed as long as there's been men going to war, because it is a traumatizing, horrific experience. And I thought, at the time the book came out, I thought Lee never knew that his whole life, because it really didn't come into prominence until after he died. Well, once the book came out, a gentleman I had interviewed earlier, I came back in contact with a friend of his named Ralph O'Hara, whom he was very close with. I asked him about that, and Ralph said, yeah, Lee knew he had it. He found out. It was like the year or two before he died, but he found out in a very interesting way, in that he was helping a friend who was putting together a documentary about Vietnam vets, and he wanted Lee to look at the interviews he had done with guys who had PTSD. And while he was watching the video, Ralph O'Hara was there, Lee just kind of went, oh my God, they're talking about the exact same things I've been dealing with. I have PTSD.
Wow.
So I wish I'd have known that at the time I was working on the book, but I didn't find out till after. But in any event, he was able to channel those experiences into his work, which I found fascinating. I mean, there were other actors who had gone through the war, some of them, extremely horrific experiences. Audie Murphy, Neville Brand, some of the most decorated men of the war, and they were actors. But they never reached the level of success Lee did, where Lee, in 1965, he was the #1 male box office star in the country. So with that kind of power and celebrity, he was able to do whatever he wanted to do and make whatever films he wanted to make. And he focused like a laser beam on what that experience was like in wonderfully made classic action films. The Professionals, Point Blank, Emperor of the North, The Dirty Dozen. I mean, you name it. They're wonderful, wonderful films of that genre.
Absolutely. Dwayne Epstein joining us for the hour on Studio 411. The book Lee Marvin, Point Blank, published by Schaffner Press. The website for more information, www.pointblankbook.com. I also got the impression, and of course I think it probably comes out in true form, because you did spend a lot of time interviewing his first wife, Betty. He was very fortunate during those years leading up to when he won the Oscar in 1965 for Best Actor. She was really kind of like his ear as far as soliciting, or not soliciting, but overseeing and reviewing scripts and plot ideas. I really think, and you cover a little section in the back of the book, some of the movies that he, in later years, after he was no longer married to Betty, that he turned down. I mean, just two, for instance, that I mentioned to a colleague. I mean, he could have had the role of Patton, which, of course, George C. Scott won an Oscar for. And he also, I assume, turned down the role that probably Robert Shaw had in Jaws. So there's just two of many that you surmise or know for a fact that he turned down, that he could have had.
Well, that's very true, and I know when you read it on just face value on a blank piece of paper, you wind up scratching your head going, how could he turn that down? But there's a story. He had a reasoning that made sense, at least to himself. When it came, Meyer Mishkin, his career-long agent, who I got to interview at length as well, told me why he turned down Patton. From what I understand, he didn't even read the script. When he saw the name of the script was Patton, Lee Marvin just said no out of hand. And when Meyer asked him why, Lee Marvin said, how could I play a guy I couldn't stand?
That's right.
When it came to Jaws, it seems rather insane now to think, how could you have turned down Jaws? His logic was, when he read the script, Steven Spielberg at the time wasn't all that well known, and he didn't know that Spielberg was a director with a certain vision. And what he saw in the script was, he said it was a very small movie. It was just about 3 men in a boat, and he didn't care for that.
I'm surprised, given his love of fishing, you would have thought that would have helped draw him to it.
Don't get ahead of me, because there's the other part of the reason there.
Yeah, and
Marvin did indeed love fishing, especially deep-sea fishing.
Yeah.
And there was a book he owned the rights to called Tournament, which was it was a novel, but it was a novel about a deep-sea fishing contest off the Great Barrier Reef and the interaction of the characters. And he was desperately trying to get financing for that as opposed to making Jaws. And that's what he was hoping would come to pass, but unfortunately it never did. He never wanted to invest in the movie himself. He was trying to get investors for himself. And so sadly, it never came to pass, but that's what he wanted to make. I'll tell you something. The one that most people drop their jaws over is the fact that he didn't make The Wild Bunch, and instead he made Paint Your Wagon.
Right, Paint Your Wagon, which was an okay movie, but again, The Wild Bunch, is like, and it's an iconic movie. And when you think of, people like Ernest Borgnine, William Holden. By the way, who got his part in that movie? The way you see it.
Well, it's not the way I see it. It's an actual fact. I got this information from the Academy Library, the file they had on the memos of Sam Peckinpah, in that I discovered Lee Marvin helped write the script. He made suggestions. He was friends with one of the co-writers, a gentleman named Roy Sickner, and it was Lee Marvin who turned the script over to Sam Peckinpah. Marvin was really gung-ho on the project. He really wanted to do it, and he saw the character of Pike Bishop, the William Holden part, as himself. And at the time, it took a long time to get it into production, and when it finally did get into production, Marvin was choosing between either the Wild Bunch or Paint Your Wagon. And at that time, he was being offered $1 million. It was one of his first, if not the first, $1 million paycheck he was offered, which is a really good incentive. But that aside, he wasn't. I think he was still in the South Pacific, filming Hell in the Pacific, when he was asked to decide. And because he couldn't get back to L.A. when they were going to have the meeting the next day, he told Meyer Mishkin, you'll be my proxy. I'll go with whatever you want. But I got to tell you, I just read the Paint Your... And by the way, a real quick aside, Meyer Mishkin didn't want him making The Wild Bunch. He thought he had been making too many violent movies in a row, and he thought he should do something lighter to help improve his screen image. And Mishkin actually wanted him to do Paint Your Wagon. And when Marvin read the Paint Your Wagon script, this is an important key factor. The script that Lee Marvin read was written by Paddy Chayefsky. And Paddy Chayefsky is probably one of the greatest screenwriters who ever lived. And that script is what Marvin read, and he loved it. He said the part of Ben Rumson fits him like a glove, and he wanted to do it. So Meyer Mishkin consequently told the producers of The Wild Bunch he's going to pass on The Wild Bunch. Now, when Paint Your Wagon went into production, that was not the script that Lee Marvin read. It was, in fact, Paddy Chayefsky wanted his name taken off the credit, and he wasn't given screenwriting or even co-screenwriting credit. He was given the credit of, adaptation by Paddy Chayefsky. And that's like being an administrative assistant. I mean, what the heck does that mean, adaptation, when they had on screen 2 or 3 other writing credits?
Exactly. Yeah.
Chayefsky later said, I think maybe there were 3 or 4 lines that I wrote that still stayed in the movie. That's about it.
It's interesting because you hear about so many actors and actresses, wanting to expand, wanting to broaden their horizon. And I get that. But that would kind of be like saying, well, let's have Charles Bronson do a remake of South Pacific. It's kind of like sometimes you need to stick with what you're good at and let it ride out. Because notice after that, he really didn't do anything of that kind of musical kind of upbeat nature. Again, he was what he was, Holden was like that, Ernest Borgnine, these guys, Robert Ryan, Burt Lancaster, they didn't do musicals. They did, gritty westerns, dramas, about society, about the tough things in the world. And, and sometimes I think they reach, or maybe they're people that are their people. But the other point is, too, by that point, Betty, who he had married in 1952, he was no longer technically with her. So I think that really clouded some of those decisions.
To a certain extent, yeah, and I'll tell you something. I'm one of those rare people that actually likes Paint Your Wagon, and I think he's wonderful in it. And as one critic said at the time, that it was a part tailor-made for Walter Houston, and I can see that. But I think Lee put his own spin on it, and it looked like he had a lot of fun because that fun was contagious. I do think it's overly long, it's plotting, it's overblown, but it's still fun to watch. It was one of the last of the 1960s roadshow films that was big and bombastic and what have you. It didn't quite know where it wanted to go in a certain sense. But that said, you're absolutely right about Betty Marvin, because even though they were divorced, she told me that Lee sent a limo to her to go see Paint Your Wagon in, I think it was Westwood or something. And when it was over, she got in the limo, she went home, and Lee was waiting for her and said, "What do you think?" And Betty Marvin told him. And Lee just lost his temper. He went, "I knew you would." Well, Betty told me that she said, "Lee, it stinks."
Wow.
Lee lost it. He goes, "I knew you were going to say that. I knew it." And it was like that Ralph Cramden thing. Like, the more he was yelling at Alice, the more he was really yelling at himself.
That's right.
I think Lee knew that it missed the mark. And that happened on occasion with every actor. And that was his missed mark, I guess.
A little tidbit about Betty that I have to throw in, because I was utterly fascinated when I heard this. This could be a whole book unto. Go ahead. That Betty at one point in time was a nanny to Joan Crawford's children.
That's right.
Oh that's a mini series right there, my friend. I'm telling you.
I think they did recently, that movie Feud.
No, oh yeah, but I don't know.
Wonderful. Love that show.
No, I mean
Very well done.
just on what Betty had to endure. I'm sure it was a short-lived proposition.
I have to tell you, when I first met Betty early on, and she was reading my mind. I hadn't been in her presence more than 2 or 3 minutes, and I said to her, I understand, is it true that you were Joan Crawford's children's nanny? And before I could get to the next part of the sentence, Betty said, yes, and it's all true. Yeah, because at the time Christina Crawford's book came out, it was not just because of what she wrote, but there was a controversy over whether it was true or not. Now that her mother's dead, she could say all these things. Who knows? But when I asked Betty didn't blink an eye, and she said, yes, it's all true.
We're looking at an image of Lee Marvin back in probably that would have been 1966, right? The Best Actor Awards for the year 1965. His role in Cat Ballou, and from that, we're looking at another shot of Lee in the movie The Professionals. Another tidbit that I remember from you're talking about The Professionals, Robert Ryan was in it, Woody Strode, Burt Lancaster, and Lee, and actually they filmed that just before the Academy Awards came upon them. And it was interesting, there was a quote in there about, I guess all those guys were like private first class in the military, and they're like, well, we're doing this. Well, where are all the colonels and generals? I mean,
yeah, that was Lee.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm not trying to paint them all with a brush, but it's interesting. You definitely got the impression that, like Robert Ryan, from what I've read about him, maybe even Burt, but a lot of people that, they naturally, they came back from the war, all kind of scarred in their own way. I mean, we see that even today in today's, whether it's Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's a tough situation to be in.
Indeed. Every one of those actors you mentioned, there, of course, their war experiences were different. I'm a huge Burt Lancaster fan, by the way. I would love to have written about him, but there's way too many books on the market about him already. But that aside, Lancaster's experience during the war was that he was in special services, and he performed acrobatic stuff, and what he did that he was famous for in Italy, I believe. So he never really saw combat or experienced combat per se. Not the way somebody like Lee did. And it's interesting in that although their chemistry on film together in the movie The Professionals is wonderful, it's one of those great male bonding things where you could tell these two guys have a history together, and they're not kids, they're middle-aged men in an action-adventure scenario, making it that much more perilous to the audience, because if they get shot, they're going to die. They're not going to come back again. But that all said, Lancaster and Marvin really didn't get along off screen because they had nothing in common. Lancaster was a kind of a pseudo-intellectual. He liked opera. He liked good books. He was of a different mindset. Also, too, he was going through his own private hell during the making of that film because his daughter had, I believe, eloped with Ernie Kovac's son. Or it might have been the other way around. Lancaster's son had
Ernie's daughter, yeah.
And he was going through that. So he had his own demons to deal with. And in the meantime, Marvin had broken up with his wife, and he was in a very strange relationship with Michelle Triola.
Yes.
And, nowadays, there, guys like Matt Damon and Ben Affleck or George Clooney and Matt Damon, if they were going through that kind of thing, they would talk about it. Well, Lancaster and Marvin weren't of that generation. Guys didn't necessarily do that, I got my problems and they're mine. You got yours and they're yours.
Well, that would be a sign of weakness, and that's still...
Yeah, exactly.
That's
and
still
they weren't raised that way. Men had to be strong.
That's a psychiatrist's, psychiatrist's gold mine when you get people like that. And we're all like that probably to some degree. No, I don't deny that. But
and so consequently, when I discovered that, I was really amazed. That's why the movie is so aptly titled. These guys were professionals. I never knew that they didn't like each other. It never showed.
I have to show a photo here if we can get this image. To the left, we have Roman Polanski. We have Lee Marvin on the right. In between there, looking almost like Joyce DeWitt from Three's Company, but it's not Joyce. It's Michelle Triola, later Michelle Triola Marvin, and that's a whole escapade in itself. And then second from the left, the late Sharon Tate. And if you don't know about Sharon Tate, well, then that's something to definitely pursue and and find out more about. But yeah, so that was circa 1967, 68 right there, before Sharon's untimely death in 1969. Another thing, too, in the book that I thought was a great feature was you were able to gain access to a series of GI letters that Lee wrote home. And again, just I thought it was tremendous because it really showed not only what he was going through, maturity level, angst, but also just kind of give a good feel of what a soldier, writing home would have talked about, and in some cases didn't talk about.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I got to tell you, I was extremely fortunate, and I was under the gun when I got to that part. And it's a very, very important part of Lee's life, as I think I pointed out earlier, that it really did affect the rest of his life, his time in the war. And I'm not Ernest Hemingway. I'm not Ernie Pyle either, in that I've never experienced combat, let alone even been in the service, and I didn't know how to write about that. And I got to tell you, I'm very cognizant of the fact that when stuff like that is written, if it's not written correctly, it's really, really obvious, and it's a big turnoff. Speaking of myself as a reader, when I come across it, that if you don't know what you're doing, it shows, and it's terrible. And I was putting that part of the book off as long as I could, and my publisher, editor, Tim Schaffner, kept asking me for that chapter, and I didn't know what to do. So in trying to organize my notes for that chapter, I took the letters I had gotten through the good graces of Robert Marvin, his brother, who opened up the family archives to me, and it was quite a treasure trove. I took those letters and I put them all in chronological order to get it in order, to do the research. And when I did, I realized, I have a letter from Lee every day of the week he was in the service, sometimes several in 1 week. And as I put them all in order, I realized, heck, he can write the chapter. I don't have to do it. All I'd have to do is clean up the grammar and, some transitional sentences and paragraphs and link it, whatever. But for the most part, he could tell it in his own words. And by the way, the thing about cleaning it up was not easy, because he wrote in hieroglyphics. One reason being he wasn't the greatest grammarian in the world, and the other was oftentimes he was writing under combat conditions. So, and it showed. But once I was able to translate those hieroglyphics, like the Rosetta Stone, I had the chapter written by Lee, and as you just said, you could see this metamorphosis take place from a cocky young recruit to a war-hardened veteran. And at one point, I decided, because of something he wrote, I decided that would be the name of the chapter. When he wrote his father home towards the end of his time in the service, he wrote, "I have had my fill of war." And I thought, that's a chapter title right there.
Yeah, for sure. Dwayne Epstein joining us on Studio 411. The book, Lee Marvin Point Blank, published by Schaffner Press. For more information, www.pointblankbook.com. Another thing, too, again, there's so many facets of this book, again, that we just can't cover it all even in the hour that we have with you. But an amazing array of stars and well-known people that Lee Marvin worked with, not only during his early years. I mean, he worked with like Humphrey Bogart, briefly. He certainly wasn't on the same level as Bogart, although there have been some comparisons to him in terms of the way that they elevated their careers, starting out maybe as supporting people and elevating themselves. Robert Ryan, you mentioned Burt Lancaster, he did like 3 or 4 movies with John Wayne. I mean, it just, we're talking like the pantheon of acting greats here. Jimmy Stewart, and they shot Liberty Valance, just tremendous. And even in his later years, we're looking at a photo here of him and Paul Newman. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was Pocket Money, the movie that they were in?
Yeah, they worked together twice, and the last time was in 1972, Pocket Money.
What was the first one? I forget.
It was a movie one of Newman's first films. It was in the early 50s, a movie called The Rack.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah.
It was written by Rod Serling. It's a pretty good movie. It's not great, but it's pretty good. And Marvin's only in like 2 or 3 scenes.
Oh, so that way early. I gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Let's touch on something to 1963, again, a couple of years before really superstardom hits. Lee's mother dies, and again, I just got a kind of an inkling here, a vibe that he really was having tremendous difficulties with that, and almost that may have even escalated maybe the drinking, because even some of his reactions sometimes with his then wife was almost like totally inconsolable, almost like he would talk to her like he was talking to his mother.
Yeah, by the way, I just want to say real quick, I thank you for mentioning the book as much as you have. I think that's wonderful. But if people are having trouble being able to buy it on my website, pointblankbook.com, it is available everywhere. That said, Betty Marvin had told me that on occasion when he would drink, he would call Betty mother, and that would bother her a lot. She would say, "Your mother was in New York. I'm not your mother." And as far as his drinking goes, that was really something that existed. It, of course, worsened during and after the war, but it pretty much existed kind of throughout his life. Even when he was in high school, when he was going to St. Leo's School for Boys, at the time that's what it was called. It was a prep school. He made... what they used to call, I guess, torpedo juice or whatever, from the grapefruits, from fermented grapefruits. He made alcohol, and he would sell it to the underclassmen as well as drink it himself. I found that out from a guy he went to school with. So, and also his parents drank. And it was also a different time in terms of when they drank. As Woody Strode said to me, whom I interviewed, he said, my generation, we didn't see alcohol as a bad thing. It was medicinal. It was a way to get to go to sleep. It was a way to make yourself comfortable when you're upset, relaxed. He goes, my generation thought of liquor differently. And, well, that's what he told me anyway, and they were of the same age. And so it started early on, but naturally after the war, it escalated. And as I discovered when it came to PTSD, it doesn't matter how long a stretch there is between types of calamities or traumas in somebody's life. If somebody who hadn't been, had been in the war 20 years earlier, if they go through a divorce or if a family member dies or something like that, they could be completely fine. But when that trauma happens, all of a sudden they're drinking, they're having bad dreams and nightmares, and they don't even know why. It's because it's a snap back to something that had happened before. And in the case of Lee's mother passing, Courtney, when she died, Betty told me that on the plane back from the funeral, he hadn't had a drink in a while, but when they got on the plane on the way back, he ordered like 3 martinis. And she was very, very upset by that and asked him why. And Lee just kind of smirked at her and said, well, she's dead now, isn't she? And then, he downed the martinis. So it was kind of like on that level. And the other thing is, too, he also had a very tenuous relationship with his mother. He loved her, of course, but at the same time, he found her to be incredibly hypocritical, and he hated the amount of emphasis she put on the importance of social stature. She was an old Southern woman from Virginia. Not an old Southern woman. She was a woman of Southern respectability and social standing from Virginia, and that was important to her. And she prided herself on the fact that she was a distant relative to George Washington and all that kind of stuff. And Lee hated that. He wasn't about that. But it was still a part of him, too. So, there was that. Like all of us, we have paradoxes within us. But with Lee's, I think they were more extreme.
One thing about Lee, I don't think I've ever met or read about or encountered a person. I think this is not more than a trifecta. What would the 4 would be? The quadrant. I don't even know. He went to a private school, actually 5 if you count regular public school, private school, boarding school, military school, and Catholic school. And except for the last one, where through sports and getting into some acting, I think finally kind of reined him in a little bit. Reined him in is what the word I'm trying to say. Just phenomenal that he was that wild of a young man, and with obviously those issues that he was dealing with way before the drinking, that it took going to all these many schools. I mean, his parents must have been just pulling their hair out.
Well, I'll tell you, what you're saying is all true, but I'll say something about that. When Lee got older, in interviews on talk shows or with columnists or newspaper entertainment reporters, what have you, he loved to create his own mythology, and he was very good at it. And a lot of what he said was kind of exaggerated. In some instances, they were out and out made up. But I'll say this. I checked the physical records, his school records from different schools he went to. He claimed to have been thrown out of over 100 schools. No, he wasn't. A dozen might be close, and they're both private and public. And the actual stories themselves as to why he was kicked out is stuff that when you read about it today would kind of go, they kicked him out for that. But this was the 1930s, and they did that in those days. What I love is the fact that he went to a progressive school called the Monument School, which was kind of like bordered on, socialism, in that it was all about having good feelings for each other, and they had their versions of rap sessions, and they grew their own vegetables on the farm and the school and all this kind of stuff. But and I read the report, and part of it is in the book. I read the report that the teacher wrote about Lee, who at the time I think was 11 years old, trying as hard as he possibly could to put a positive spin on what Lee's personality was like and how he interacted with other kids. And it's pretty funny because you can tell this guy is really fighting what he really wants to say because he has to put a positive spin on it. And ultimately, Lee got kicked out of school for smoking. He got caught smoking behind the school property or something like that. But Lee always said that they exaggerated it and said that he was caught fooling around with a couple of girls. And Lee always said, that's not even possible. I didn't even have hair on my chest yet. How could I be doing that? But that was Lee's take on it. More famously, he got kicked out of a school. It was a Quaker school for throwing another student out of a second-story window.
Nice. There you go. I've heard of dangling a student back in the day, but no, actually heaving them out. That's pretty good. Pretty good. Dwayne Epstein joining us, author of Lee Marvin, Point Blank, by Schaffner Press. For more information, pointblankbook.com, and the remaining moments we have with Dwayne. Image to my left of one of Lee's, I believe it was his last movie that he made before his early passing. Lee on the left, along with Chuck Norris, called The Delta Force, which again was a movie that, as a matter of fact, I think we have a still that shows the theatrical poster for that movie. And if you look at that as well as this shot, I mean, you can see where Lee certainly has aged tremendously in the years since obviously the book cover from his Oscar-winning movie Cat Ballou. There you go. I see the theatrical poster there. Again, he's a man who's on borrowed time. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's funny. There's this really sad paradox in that Delta Force was his last film, and unfortunately his last film was kind of like the antithesis of everything he had been doing in his career up to then. He didn't want to make violence look cartoony or like a Chuck Norris movie, and it winds up being his last film. I mean, and if you've seen the film, Lee is actually pretty good in it. I like, he has some great moments, but Chuck Norris is laughable. I mean, he takes on the entire Egyptian army single-handedly on his rocket-powered motorcycle. It's pretty ridiculous, and it's great for Chuck Norris fans, but it doesn't really deal with the issue of what the movie's supposed to be about, which is anti-terrorism. And one of my favorite quotes from somebody was Meyer Mishkin, his agent, who, by the way, I should add to, that's extremely rare in Hollywood. That Lee Marvin had the same agent from the day he became an actor in Hollywood until the day he died. They never parted company. Well, there was a brief...
Right, there was one where he went to work for, was it MCA agency or whatever?
Yeah, when he was doing M-Squad.
And that lasted about 3 weeks.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, when Meyer Mishkin was talking to me, he said he choked up. He said, I watched Delta Force on TV the other night, and he just looked so bad. And Meyer teared up, and he said, it's a shame with the drinking and the smoking what it got to him, and because he could have been great for a lot longer.
Well, they did one the year or so before that. They did what in essence was correct me if I'm wrong, a TV movie that actually spawned several others of the Dirty Dozen. And the way I read it in your book, I mean, the plot was actually set like a month or two after the original, but if you look at Lee Marvin then and then Lee Marvin, later, I mean, it's like, it's like two different, it's like somebody and their grandfather. I mean, it's ridiculous, Yeah,
he had gotten to the point in his career where he was doing stuff that he knew he didn't want to do and wasn't very good in the first place, but he just wanted to keep active if possible and get out of the house. That's what Meyer Mishkin told me, that I don't know how much he made on Delta Force. It was a whole lot less than what he made on Paint Your Wagon, I know that. But Meyer said he just wanted to get out of the house. And I said, why would he make something terrible like that? And Meyer got a little upset with that question. He said, you tell an ex-Marine he can't do something. Go ahead.
Exactly, yeah.
And I said, all right, no, that's okay, I won't.
Now, in the mid-'70s, after a movie, and I'm going to mention just the movie to get to my next point, so hold your thoughts on this movie, but I just thought it was great. 1973, he did a movie, The Iceman Cometh, and just to show you how his career spans even someone from this time in our lives that is having a tremendous amount of success. Featured Frederick March, who came out of retirement, again, I believe another Oscar winner from way back when, Robert Ryan, a fine actor who died shortly after, and along with Lee Marvin, a young Jeff Bridges. So I thought, how cool is that? And here Jeff Bridges is all these 40 some years later, and Jeff is, is actually at the level that Lee and so many of the greats were, in their time.
Indeed.
Mid-70s, Lee decides, well, he's got a new wife, actually was like a love of his life back in the day. They leave Hollywood for Tucson, Arizona, and so he kind of leaves acting for a few years. In the remaining couple of minutes we have, we talk about 1979, and this had been dragging on for a few years. The epic palimony suit between former girlfriend Michelle Triola, or she called herself Michelle Triola Marvin, and Lee made headlines that I think today would have been all over social media minute by minute.
You bet, you bet. And by the way, that trial is completely misunderstood and remembered incorrectly today, and that's one of the things I clarify in the book. But if I may, real quick,
sure.
When you mentioned the Iceman Comet in 1973, forgotten film, worth seeing again if you've got the time and inclination to watch it. Marvin is brilliant, so is the entire cast. Frederick March and Robert Ryan's last film, by the way, the both of them. And I was lucky enough to get Jeff Bridges to agree to an interview. And he spoke to me about working on that film and how working on that film and working with guys like that made him ultimately decide to spend his entire life working as an actor. Because at the time, he was still on a fence. He was thinking about being a professional surfer, he told me, thinking about maybe joining a rock band, whatever, and he liked acting, but he wasn't sure if this is what he wanted. But he said working with those guys, that convinced him.
So he went on to do The Big Lebowski, and he still comes off like a surfer at times. So
yeah, right.
he got the best of both worlds. I'm sure Lloyd, his dad Lloyd, who of course many of us remember, and his mom they've passed now. I know Lloyd has. They're very proud of both Jeff and Bo. But touch a little bit about Michelle Triola Marvin, gold digger, or how would we paint the late Miss Triola?
Well, I'll tell you, I went into this, despite of what some critics of the book have said or assumed that I had an axe to grind against her. I didn't. I didn't know her. I've never had any contact with her. I did attempt to interview her, but it never came to pass. But that aside, I discovered through people who knew them and also people who knew her, and a lot of the media that was surrounding the case at the time, the portrait that's painted of her in the book is a portrait painted via those ways of knowing who she was, in that the media gobbled up everything that she and her lawyer put out there, and they got a lot wrong. I was amazed that they took everything she said on face value. She said she used to dance with Jose Greco in his flamenco troupe because she was an extra in Ship of Fools, and that's how she met Lee. You know, you don't just wake up one morning and decide you're going to be a flamenco dancer and wind up in probably the most famous flamenco dance troupe ever. It doesn't work that way. But the media printed it. I mean, they accepted that. They also accepted everything she said when she said things like, Lee and I are still friends, and I'm the one who talked him into marrying Pam. And you read these magazine articles from the 70s, and it's jaw-dropping what people wrote without checking. It was bizarre. But the most important factor that I discovered by interviewing his lawyer, by the way, whom really didn't get as much media attention as the much more flamboyant Marvin Mitchelson, who was her lawyer. His lawyer was Dave, oh, God, I'm drawing a blank now. David.
Yeah, 30 seconds.
I can't remember his last name. Anyway, I got to interview him at length, and he told me wonderful anecdotes about the trial that the most of the media missed, and more importantly, the outcome. People forget. Lee won that case on every single legal count. And there was a great twist ending to the case that the readers will probably find out by reading.
We'll leave it as a cliffhanger, absolutely. In closing, a couple of minutes with Dwayne Epstein of Lee Marvin, Point Blank. A quote from the late Christopher L. Marvin, Lee's first child, only son. Quote, aside from being a great actor, my father was very complex. He was independent, kind, funny, generous, and could spot a phony a mile away. hopefully I've inherited some of those qualities. I miss him, and as you stated, not long after that, Christopher, of course, passed away as well. So, Dwayne, again, we thank you for joining us. We enjoyed the book tremendously. Dwayne Epstein, the book Lee Marvin, Point Blank, the website pointblankbook.com, and we thank you for joining us. So we look forward to your next effort.
Well, thank you very much. Larry, I'm very much appreciative of you having me on. I enjoyed this immensely.
Very good, very good. Hang in there with us. And also another thing in the book, too, for the audience, it's got added material, a reader's guide, an author Q&A, and over 50 photographs, many of which we did not even see here. So, again, it's
right. Oh, in the paperback version.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. All right, you hang in there with us a minute, and we thank all of you out there for joining us on this episode of Studio 411. Dwayne Epstein and the book Lee Marvin, Point Blank, has been our guest today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time on Studio 411. Take care.